Good evening, friends, comrades, and fellow citizens of the world. I'm Professor RichardDWolff, and tonight we confront an event that has shaken the global order to its core: Yemen's unprecedented submarine strike. Yes, Yemen, one of the poorest nations on earth, long devastated by war and foreign intervention, has just delivered a blow that no one saw coming. And this, my friends, is not merely a military story. It is an economic and political earthquake, one that exposes the fragility of global power and the hypocrisy of those who thought dominance could last forever. Yemen's unseen power move has sent tremors across the global political and economic landscape, stunning military analysts and confounding world powers. For decades, Yemen has been portrayed as a fragile nation, one devastated by war, famine, and foreign intervention, barely holding its political and economic structure together. Yet beneath that image of weakness, something extraordinary was brewing. With this unprecedented submarine strike, Yemen has rewritten the global narrative about power, technology, and resistance. It's the kind of moment that forces the world to pause and ask, how did one of the poorest countries on earth manage to pull off a strike that shook the most powerful nations in existence? To understand the shock, we need to understand the symbolism. This wasn't just a missile launched from beneath the waves. It was a message surfacing from the depths of oppression. Yemen's move didn't just disrupt a military target, it disrupted global assumptions. The world had grown used to seeing Yemen as a passive victim of geopolitical games, but in this moment the so-called powerless became powerful. The narrative shifted from desperation to defiance. It was as if Yemen had emerged from the ashes to say, "You underestimated us, and now the balance of power has changed." What makes this move so fascinating isn't only its military execution, but its psychological and political impact. Yemen has been under relentless pressure, airstrikes, sanctions, blockades, all tools designed to weaken its will and cripple its infrastructure. Yet, instead of submission, the world witnessed innovation. Somewhere in the chaos, engineers, strategists, and ordinary citizens pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. The result? A moment that shocked intelligence agencies and defense analysts alike. This wasn't supposed to happen, and yet it did. Now imagine the ripple effect. Governments across the world are now sitting in closed rooms, analyzing how a nation with limited resources managed such a sophisticated strike. Defense systems are being reevaluated, military doctrines are being rewritten. Suddenly, the old equation, power equals wealth and technology, is being questioned. Yemen's action showed that in a world defined by asymmetrical warfare, ingenuity can outmaneuver dominance. That's the real shock, the realization that power isn't just about money or machinery, it's about will, creativity, and the refusal to accept defeat. But let's be clear, this move was never just about military victory. It was about reclaiming dignity. Yemen's strike is a statement not just to its regional adversaries, but to the world order itself. For years, global powers justified their intervention under the pretense of stability, democracy, or counterterrorism. Yet beneath those words lay an agenda of control, economic, political, and ideological. With this act, Yemen turned that narrative upside down. The oppressed are no longer playing by the rules written by the powerful. They're writing their own. The most compelling part of this development is what it represents for the future of global politics. If a nation under siege can strike with such precision and purpose, what does that mean for the existing hierarchy of global power? For nations long subjected to economic dependency or military occupation, Yemen's move may be a spark, a symbol of what's possible when resilience replaces resignation. And for the empires watching, it's a warning. The age of one-sided control is ending. The world's underdogs are not only rising, they're diving deep, innovating in silence, and emerging from the depths with shockwaves that can no longer be ignored. The aftermath of Yemen's submarine strike has rippled far beyond the battlefield. It has hit the global economy like a sudden earthquake beneath calm waters. Within hours of the attack, oil markets shuddered, shipping insurers panicked, and energy traders scrambled to assess the new reality. The Red Sea, once considered a reliable corridor for global trade, instantly became a zone of anxiety. The world's financial centers, from New York to London, from Riyadh to Shanghai, felt the tremor. What began as a single military maneuver evolved into an economic event with consequences that could reshape the flow of commerce, capital, and confidence for years to come. The reason this strike sent such deep shock waves is simple. It targeted not just a vessel, but a system built on predictability, control, and uninterrupted profit. The global economy depends on stability in the world's shipping lanes, and the Red Sea is one of its main arteries. Every day, millions of barrels of oil, goods, and raw materials pass through those waters. When Yemen demonstrated the ability to strike in that zone, it did more than damage a ship. It reminded the world that the roots of globalization are vulnerable. And when those roots are threatened, the machinery of capitalism begins to stutter. Within hours, oil prices spiked. Investors, already jittery from inflation and supply chain instability, rushed towards safe assets like gold. Major shipping companies began rerouting vessels to avoid the Red Sea, adding thousands of miles and millions of dollars in additional fuel costs. Insurance rates for tankers skyrocketed. Every change, every detour added pressure to a world economy still struggling to recover from past disruptions. The strike exposed the fragile threads that connect nations, showing just how quickly the illusion of global control can unravel when one of the smallest players decides to act. For economists and analysts, the message was unmistakable. Economic dominance is not invincibility. The strike revealed how even a seemingly marginal nation can disrupt global systems through asymmetric tactics. When a country under siege can send shockwaves through the world's trading platforms, it reveals that power has shifted from the traditional hands of empires to those who understand the vulnerabilities of global dependence. This event reminded markets and policymakers that the global economy, despite its scale, runs on confidence, and confidence can collapse faster than a submarine can submerge. But there's a deeper layer here, one that Professor Wolff has long emphasized: the connection between economics and politics. The strike is not just a military retaliation, it is a protest against an unjust global order. The world's richest nations have spent decades using economic tools, sanctions, blockades, and debt to maintain dominance over poorer regions. Yemen's action flipped that script, forcing the global economy to feel the sting of the same instability it has so often imposed on others. It is the economy of the oppressed striking back at the economics of oppression. As markets reel and politicians scramble for explanations, one thing is clear: the era of guaranteed economic control is over. The myth of invulnerability has been pierced. The shockwaves from Yemen's submarine strike are not just financial, they are philosophical. They challenge the assumption that wealth ensures safety, that technology guarantees superiority, and that the global South must always play the role of victim. The world's economic elite, watching their charts flicker and their profits tremble, are now confronted with a sobering truth. In a deeply interconnected system, the powerless are never truly powerless. One calculated move from below can send the entire structure above into panic. Behind every missile that shakes the world lies a story not only of engineering and warfare, but of economics, an intricate web of production, trade, and exploitation that fuels the engines of conflict. Yemen's submarine strike is no exception. While the headlines focus on the dramatic moment of impact, the deeper question is far more revealing. What economic forces made this possible, and what global system does it challenge? The truth is, this strike was as much an economic statement as a military one, and understanding it requires looking beyond the battlefield to the balance sheets and supply chains that sustain global power. For years, Yemen has been economically strangled. Sanctions, blockades, and the destruction of infrastructure have turned daily survival into a constant struggle. Factories halted, ports were shut, and currency collapsed. Yet out of this economic suffocation emerged something the world didn't expect: innovation born from necessity. When traditional supply chains were cut off, Yemenis learned to improvise. When imported technology was denied, they turned to local ingenuity. Every piece of that submarine, every circuit and propeller represents not only resistance, but adaptation, a direct product of an economy forced to create under constraint. That transformation alone is a powerful reminder that desperation can often outthink domination. At the same time, the global economy itself has been complicit in the conditions that made this strike inevitable. The same international systems that claim to promote stability have long relied on exploiting nations like Yemen, extracting resources, dictating trade policies, and enforcing debt dependence. Global powers have profited from instability, using military and economic leverage to maintain control over critical regions. But with this submarine strike, Yemen has effectively weaponized the very system that tried to suppress it. The global economic network that relies on control and predictability has been turned against itself, and the shockwaves are not just political, they're systemic. What makes this moment particularly striking is the economic symbolism it carries. The missile was not fired merely from a submarine. It was fired from decades of economic inequality. It represents the rage of workers, farmers, and families who have endured the harsh costs of a global economy designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. The so-called free market has never been free for nations like Yemen. It has been a cage. And when you corner a population economically for too long, when you strip them of access to trade, technology, and dignity, they eventually find a way to strike back, often in ways that redefine the balance of global power. The irony is painful yet profound. The world's richest nations have spent trillions building weapons, bases, and alliances to protect their interests, yet one of the poorest countries managed to disrupt that very security with far less. That inversion of economic logic, the weak defeating the strong, exposes the underlying contradictions of global capitalism. It shows that power is not always proportional to wealth, and that the economic roots of war run far deeper than profit margins and defense budgets. This event, in essence, forces the world to confront a truth that economists like myself have warned about for decades. When economic inequality becomes too vast, when nations are treated as expendable markets rather than partners in development, the results will not remain confined to spreadsheets. They will erupt into the real world. The economics behind the missile is the economics of inequality, of exploitation, of broken promises of globalization. And now, as markets tremble and governments reassess their strategies, the question is no longer about how Yemen built the weapon. It's about how the global economic order built the conditions for it to be used. Resistance born from desperation is one of history's most powerful forces, a current that runs deeper than strategy or ideology. Yemen's submarine strike stands as a vivid embodiment of that truth. When a nation has been cornered by war, starved by sanctions, and stripped of sovereignty, resistance becomes not just an act of defiance, but an act of survival. The world is witnessing how the very desperation meant to crush a people can instead transform into their greatest weapon. What unfolded beneath the waves was more than a military maneuver. It was a declaration from a nation long dismissed, a message from the margins of global power that says, "We may be broken, but we are not defeated." For nearly a decade, Yemen has endured one of the most devastating humanitarian crises in modern history. Its economy has collapsed, millions have faced famine, and foreign powers have turned the nation into a testing ground for their ambitions. Every airstrike, every embargo, every diplomatic betrayal has left deep scars. Yet, as history repeatedly shows, when oppression reaches its peak, resistance takes root. The submarine strike was born not from luxury or abundance, but from scarcity, hunger, and loss. It emerged from the determination of people who refused to vanish quietly into the ruins of history. That defiance, raw, unpolished, and fearless, is precisely what gives it such symbolic power. Desperation changes the rules of the game. It pushes innovation, unites the fragmented, and transforms weakness into unexpected strength. Yemen's engineers, soldiers, and citizens have had to improvise without the resources the world's military powers take for granted. They've learned to repair what others would discard, to design what others would deem impossible, and to build with the barest of tools. This is resistance in its purest form, resistance that grows not in laboratories or boardrooms, but in the ashes of war-torn streets. It's the kind of ingenuity that reminds the world that necessity has always been the mother of revolution. This act also exposes the moral bankruptcy of the global order that pushed Yemen to such extremes. The world's wealthiest nations imposed sanctions and blockades in the name of stability, while quietly profiting from the arms sales that prolonged the conflict. But what they didn't anticipate was that the very suffering they engineered would forge something stronger than submission, a national will hardened by loss and driven by the instinct to reclaim dignity. When people have nothing left to lose, they stop playing by the rules written by their oppressors. Yemen's strike is proof that even under siege, resistance finds a way to surface. There's an emotional resonance to this moment that transcends borders. It speaks to every nation, every people who've been told that power belongs only to the rich, the armed, and the technologically advanced. It challenges the idea that resistance is futile against the machinery of empire. The submarine strike may have been a single event, but symbolically it stands as a collective act of rebellion for all who have suffered under the weight of inequality and foreign dominance. Desperation, once thought to be Yemen's weakness, has become its greatest source of power, a catalyst that turned endurance into defiance and defiance into a strike that shook the conscience of the world. The cracks in the global order have never been more visible than they are today, and Yemen's submarine strike has widened them in ways the world's most powerful nations can no longer ignore. What was once perceived as a minor regional conflict has now exposed the deep vulnerabilities of an international system built on control, inequality, and illusion. For decades, the West's dominance rested on three unspoken assumptions: that its military superiority was unquestionable, that its economic networks were unshakable, and that its influence over the developing world was permanent. Yemen's unexpected show of force shattered all three in a single, calculated moment beneath the sea. It was not just a strike against a target, it was a symbolic rupture in the facade of global stability. The modern world economy depends on fragile lines of connection. trade routes, digital systems, supply chains, and financial institutions that are often mistaken for strength. Yet, when a single strike by a small, impoverished nation can send oil prices soaring and global markets into disarray, the illusion of stability collapses. The strike revealed that the global order, despite its wealth and technology, is built on dependency. Dependency on regions it exploits, on labor it underpays, and on resources it does not own. The balance of power has always been precarious, but Yemen's action proved just how easily the balance can tip when the oppressed stop accepting their assigned role. This event has also exposed the limits of empire in a world that is rapidly decentralizing. The era when a handful of powerful nations could dictate the terms of global politics is eroding. The strike served as a sharp reminder that the global South is no longer content to remain a silent participant in the script written by the North. Countries once dismissed as peripheral are finding leverage, not through conventional power, but through strategic unpredictability. Yemen's move was not merely military, it was psychological. It introduced uncertainty into a system that thrives on predictability, and that uncertainty is now shaking the confidence of investors, policymakers, and military planners across the globe. What's most revealing is how quickly the rhetoric of control crumbles when faced with defiance. The same leaders who once boasted about order, security, and freedom of navigation are now scrambling to contain the chaos they never anticipated. They can no longer hide behind the illusion that the system is fair or that globalization benefits all. The strike has forced an uncomfortable truth into the open, that global order has always been sustained not by cooperation, but by coercion. And coercion, once challenged, breeds instability. In the aftermath, nations are beginning to reassess their alliances, their trade dependencies, and their geopolitical assumptions. The cracks are widening because the system no longer feels inevitable. The notion that power flows only from the top has been replaced by the realization that disruption can come from anywhere, even from those written off as powerless. Yemen's submarine strike is not just a warning shot, it's a mirror reflecting a world order on the verge of transformation. The old hierarchies are losing their grip, and the margins are pushing back with ingenuity and intent. The empires that once built their dominance on the backs of others are now witnessing the quiet unraveling of that dominance, one unexpected act of resistance at a time. At a time when tensions are escalating and retaliation feels like the instinctive response, Yemen's submarine strike presents the world with a rare and uncomfortable opportunity, an opportunity for reflection rather than revenge. The event has shaken the pillars of global power, but it also offers a mirror to the world's conscience. The easy path, as always, would be escalation, more sanctions, more strikes, more speeches about restoring order. But what the world truly needs at this moment is not another cycle of destruction. It needs a reckoning. Yemen's act of defiance is not simply a threat to global stability. It is a symptom of decades of inequality, exploitation, and neglect. Until the world acknowledges those root causes, retaliation will only deepen the wounds that caused this shock in the first place. For too long, the global system has operated on the belief that force can suppress discontent. Wealthy nations have wielded economic and military might as if these were tools of peace, when in reality they have been instruments of control. Yemen's strike should be understood not as an isolated act of aggression, but as a desperate outcry from a nation suffocated by war and poverty. To respond with further aggression would be to ignore the message entirely. What Yemen has exposed is the moral bankruptcy of a world order that punishes the oppressed for daring to resist. The real challenge now is whether the global community can rise above its habitual reflexes and engage in genuine introspection. There is a deeper irony here that cannot be overlooked. The nations now condemning Yemen's actions are the same ones that armed its aggressors, funded its destruction, and turned a blind eye to its humanitarian collapse. When those who have long monopolized violence suddenly find it turned against them, their outrage rings hollow. The global powers must confront an uncomfortable truth. They helped create the very instability they now fear. Reflection, therefore, is not weakness, it is accountability. Retaliation may reassert dominance temporarily, but it will never restore legitimacy. What is needed now is not another show of strength, but a show of wisdom. This moment calls for a different kind of courage, the courage to ask why a nation like Yemen, battered and impoverished, felt compelled to strike at all. It demands that we look beyond the headlines and recognize the human story behind the missile, the years of starvation, displacement, and despair that the world chose to ignore. Every act of resistance carries a history, and ignoring that history only ensures its repetition. If the global order truly seeks stability, it must first seek justice. Without justice, peace is nothing more than silence enforced by power. Yemen's submarine strike should not be a cue for vengeance. It should be a turning point for understanding. It challenges world leaders to question the systems they defend, the hierarchies they uphold, and the narratives they perpetuate. The path forward lies not in tightening the grip of control, but in loosening it, allowing dialogue, development, and dignity to replace domination. If the global community chooses reflection over retaliation, this moment of crisis could become a moment of awakening. But if it chooses the old path of punishment and pride, then history will repeat itself, and the cracks in the global order will widen until the structure itself collapses. The question now is not who will strike back, but who will finally have the courage to stop the cycle.